Armin was a man who lived a very simple life. He was a mechanic by profession, but even calling it a profession sounded too big for what he earned. He worked at a small garage in the daytime, fixing motorcycles and cars that people brought in, but the wages he got were so little that most of the time he barely managed to buy food and pay rent. He lived alone in a tiny rented room in a crowded street where the walls were cracked, and the fan above his head made a constant noise that never let him sleep properly. Yet, despite all his struggles, he had never been the kind of man to complain. He accepted life as it came and kept moving forward one day at a time. That night was no different. It was past midnight, and Armin had just returned from a long, tiring day at the garage. His hands smelled of engine oil, his shirt had black marks from grease, and his whole body ached from bending over cars all day. He wanted nothing more than to lie down on his thin mattress and rest his eyes. The streets outside were silent, the kind of silence that only came in the deep hours of the night when even stray dogs had stopped barking. Armin switched off the dim bulb in his room, stretched his tired body, and tried to sleep. But as fate would have it, just when he began to drift into the first layer of sleep, his old mobile phone rang loudly. The sharp sound of the ringtone in the middle of the night startled him. For a moment, he thought it must be a wrong number. Who would call a mechanic at such an hour? Still, he picked it up, his voice heavy with sleep. "Hello," he said. On the other side, a woman's voice spoke, hurried and nervous. "Are you Armin, the mechanic?" "Yes," he replied, still confused. "Please, I need your help. My bedroom light, it stopped working suddenly. I can't be alone in the dark. Please, can you come right now?" Armin sat up, rubbing his eyes. He had never received such a request before. People usually called him to fix engines, not bedroom lights. And at 2 in the morning? He wanted to say no. His body screamed for rest. But then he remembered the money he owed for rent, the grocer who had given him food on credit, and the fact that one small job could mean he wouldn't go hungry tomorrow. So instead of refusing, he asked quietly, "Where do you live?" The woman quickly gave him an address. It was a place he had heard of but never seen closely before, a wealthy neighborhood at the edge of the city. A place where huge houses stood behind tall gates, the kind of houses he had only looked at from afar. Armin hesitated for a moment, then said, "All right, I'll come." He got up, washed his face with cold water, and picked up his small toolbox, the same one he had carried for years. Inside were a few screwdrivers, some wires, pliers, and other basic tools. They were old, but they had always been enough for him. He wore his faded sandals, locked his room, and stepped into the silent street. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint smell of dust and rain from earlier in the evening. The roads were empty. A few street lights flickered, casting long shadows as he walked towards the bus stop. Of course, at that time, there were no buses. So he walked, and he walked, the toolbox swinging by his side, his heart heavy with the thought of how strange this night had suddenly become. After nearly half an hour of walking, he finally reached the gates of the neighborhood. It was like stepping into another world. The streets here were wide and clean, lined with tall trees. The houses were enormous, each one hidden behind tall walls and fancy gates. Bright lamps lit the paths, and everything felt so quiet, so far from the noisy streets he was used to. For a moment, Armin felt out of place, like a man who did not belong. He wondered what kind of people lived here and why they would call someone like him for help. At last, he reached the address he had been given. It was a huge mansion with an iron gate and a security guard standing in front. The guard looked at him suspiciously at first, but when Armin mentioned the lady's name, the guard nodded and let him in. Armin walked through a long driveway surrounded by a beautiful garden. The mansion stood tall at the end, glowing with soft lights even at that late hour. His heart pounded. He had never in his life stepped into such a place. The walls were decorated with paintings, the floors shone like glass, and expensive furniture filled the rooms. He almost felt like turning back, afraid he would somehow break something just by being there. But then the sound of footsteps pulled him back to reality. A woman appeared at the staircase. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a long gown, her hair tied neatly. She looked elegant but tired, as if sleep had been far from her eyes for many nights. When she saw Armin, she gave a small smile of relief. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Please, follow me." Armin nodded politely and followed her upstairs. The house was silent, almost too silent, as if it had been waiting for someone to fill it with sound. She led him into a large bedroom. The chandelier above the bed flickered weakly, sometimes lighting up, sometimes going completely dark. "There," she said, pointing to it. "It stopped working, and I can't stay in the dark alone." Armin placed his toolbox on the floor and began his work. As he adjusted the wires and checked the switch, he couldn't help but notice the way the woman stood nearby, watching him closely. There was something lonely about her eyes, something that spoke of emptiness even in such a grand home. He worked silently, tightening screws, connecting wires, and carefully fixing the problem. His hands moved with practiced skill, even though this was different from the engines he usually worked on. After a while, the light stopped flickering and began to shine steadily again. The room brightened, filling the space with warm glow. The woman let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much this means to me." Armin packed his tools, ready to leave. For him, it was just another job, something small but necessary to survive. Yet as he turned to go, he felt that this night was different. He didn't know why, but something told him this was only the beginning of a story he never expected to be part of. Armin had expected the job to end quickly. He had thought he would fix the light, collect a little money, and walk back to his small room before dawn. But the longer he stood in that grand house, the more he realized that this night would not be like any other night of his life. The woman, whose name he later learned was Mrs. Noreen, asked him to sit for a moment after he finished. She looked at him with a strange kind of relief, as if his presence had filled a silence that had been too heavy for her to bear alone. Armin was unsure at first. He was not used to sitting in such decorated places. The chairs looked more expensive than all the things in his room put together. But her voice was gentle and firm, so he nodded and sat down on the edge of a soft chair near the window. His eyes wandered around the room. The bedroom itself was larger than the entire floor of his small rented house. The curtains were made of heavy fabric, embroidered with golden threads. The bed looked soft enough to swallow a person in comfort. The walls were painted in a soft cream color, and on one side stood a tall bookshelf filled with neatly arranged novels. Everything seemed polished, everything spoke of wealth. Yet behind that wealth, Armin sensed something missing, something that money could not buy. Mrs. Noreen stood by the window for a while, as though deciding whether to speak or not. Finally, she turned and asked, "Would you like some tea?" Armin shook his head politely at first. He wasn't sure if it was right to accept. But she insisted. "It's late. You must be tired. Let me at least give you a cup before you go." He smiled shyly. "Thank you, madam." She pressed a small button near the bed, and within minutes, a servant entered quietly carrying a tray. On it were 2 cups of steaming tea and a plate of biscuits. The servant placed it on the table and left without a word. Armin couldn't help but notice how the servant avoided eye contact, moving like a shadow. It made him wonder what kind of life people lived in this house, where even those who worked inside seemed silent and distant. They sat across from each other, sipping tea. The warm taste felt soothing to Armin after walking through the cool night air. He held the cup carefully, afraid of dropping it, because it looked fragile and expensive. For a while, silence hung between them, broken only by the soft clink of the cups. Then Mrs. Noreen spoke, her voice low but clear. "You must be wondering why I called you for something so small. A broken light, it seems silly, doesn't it?" Armin placed his cup back on the table and shook his head. "No, madam. Work is work. If someone needs help, I will come." Her eyes softened at his words. Still, most people would have refused. Who would come at 2 in the morning? But you came. She paused, looking down at her hands. "The truth is, I can't stay in the dark. It brings back too many memories. Too much loneliness." Armin didn't know how to reply, so he stayed quiet. He was not used to hearing such personal words from strangers, especially people who lived in houses like this. She looked up at him again. "You must be surprised by this place." Armin gave a small smile. "It's very big. Very beautiful. I've never seen a house like this from the inside." Her lips curved in a sad smile. "Yes, it is big. Too big for one person. Every corner echoes when I walk alone. Sometimes I feel like these walls are whispering back to me." Armin nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. His room was small and broken, but at least it was filled with life: neighbors shouting, children running, vendors calling in the street. Loneliness had no space there. But here, in this mansion, silence itself was heavy. As they talked, Armin realized that the woman was studying him closely. Maybe she was trying to understand who this poor mechanic was, sitting in her luxurious room without fear or greed. She must have met many people in her life: businessmen, relatives, guests who came with smiles but always with hidden intentions. But Armin had none of that. He was simple, direct, and tired. Perhaps that was why she seemed at ease speaking with him. Time passed, and the clock moved closer to 3 in the morning. Armin felt he should leave, but something in her expression stopped him. There was a gentleness, a quiet request in her eyes, as if she did not want him to walk out just yet. Finally, she asked him more about himself. "Where do you live, Armin?" He told her about his small rented room, his work in the garage, his struggle to make ends meet. He did not complain, he simply stated facts, the way a man used to hardship does. She listened carefully, her face showing surprise at how different his life was from hers. When he finished, she sighed. "It must be very hard." Armin gave a small laugh, not out of joy but out of habit. "It's life, madam. What can I do? I just keep working." Her eyes glistened slightly, though she quickly looked away. "I used to know someone like you," she said softly. "My husband. He was not poor like you, but he was hard-working. He believed in earning with his own hands. After he passed away, I realized how empty all this wealth feels without someone to share it with." The room fell silent again. Armin felt a strange ache in his chest, though he didn't fully understand why. He had never lost someone like that, but he knew the feeling of emptiness all too well. At last, he stood up. "Madam, thank you for the tea. I should go now. Morning is not far." She looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, but thank you, Armin. Thank you for coming. Not just for the light, but for being here." He picked up his toolbox and made his way out of the mansion. The guard opened the gate for him, and the cool night air greeted him again. As he walked down the quiet road, his mind was full. He had gone to fix a broken light, but he had left with something else: an unspoken connection, a strange feeling that this was not the last time he would see that lonely woman in the giant mansion. The next evening, Armin returned to his garage as usual. The day was long, full of engines to fix and customers to handle, yet his mind kept drifting back to the mansion he had visited the night before. He thought about the shining chandelier, the wide hallways, the silence that seemed heavier than any noise, and most of all, the face of the woman who had looked at him not as a servant, not as a worker, but almost as if she needed him there. It was unusual for him. People of wealth rarely paid attention to men like him. They gave orders, they threw money, and that was the end of it. But her eyes had carried a kind of plea, a longing that went beyond a broken light. For the first time in many months, Armin found himself thinking of something other than just survival. A few days passed. He continued his work, fixing cars and saving little coins, but one night his phone rang again. When he saw the number, he immediately recognized it. It was her. "Armin," she said, her voice calm but softer than before, "the kitchen switchboard is not working. Can you come?" He hesitated for a moment. It was late again, though not as late as before. He was tired from the day, but once again he could not say no. Maybe it was the thought of the money, maybe it was something else. He agreed and set out with his toolbox. This time, walking towards the mansion felt different. He did not feel like a stranger anymore. The security guard nodded at him with less suspicion, as if he now belonged to the list of people allowed inside. Mrs. Noreen greeted him with a small smile, and again he noticed the relief in her face when she saw him. The repair was simple. He fixed the switchboard quickly, but instead of leaving, she invited him to sit down once more. "I'll make tea myself tonight," she said, almost proudly. He was surprised. "But don't you have servants?" She gave a small laugh. "Yes, but sometimes I don't want them around. They are quiet, polite, but they don't fill the silence. You speak. You listen. That's rare." Armin didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to such attention. All his life, he had been invisible to those who had power and money. But here, in this huge mansion, he was being treated as if his presence mattered. When she returned with the tea, they sat together in the living room. The walls were lined with photographs, most of them showing her younger days with her husband. Armin noticed one large photo of her standing beside a tall man with kind eyes. They looked happy, smiling as if life had given them everything. "That's him," she said, following his gaze. "My husband. He passed away 5 years ago." Armin nodded respectfully. "I'm sorry, madam." She sighed deeply. "He was my world. After he left, I thought I would learn to live again, but instead, I learned what loneliness really is. Everyone comes to see me, but nobody stays. They come for my wealth, for business, for their own needs. But when the night falls, and the house grows quiet, it's just me." Her words struck Armin more than he expected. He thought about his own life. Though his small room was humble, though his pockets were always empty, he had never truly been lonely. The neighbors shouted, the children played in the street, the grocer laughed with him even when giving him food on credit. His life was hard, but it was full of voices. Hers was rich, but silent. That night, for the first time, Armin found himself speaking more freely. He told her about his childhood, how his father had been a rickshaw driver and how he learned to repair engines by watching men in the garage near his home. He told her about his dream of one day owning a small workshop where he could work for himself instead of under someone else's orders. She listened with full attention, her eyes never leaving his face, as though each word gave her a sense of life she had been missing. "You're a man of dignity, Armin," she said softly. "Even with nothing, you carry hope. That's rare." He smiled shyly, unused to compliments. "Hope is the only thing I can afford," he replied, half joking, half true. As the hours passed, the bond between them grew stronger. She no longer looked at him as a mechanic who came to fix things. She looked at him as someone who brought light, not just to her room but to her life. And Armin, though simple in heart, began to feel the same. He realized that beneath her elegant clothes and her wealthy home, she was just a person like him, aching for someone to talk to, someone to understand. At one point, as he stood up to leave, she reached out and gently touched his arm. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Stay with me, just for a while. Don't leave yet. The night feels too long when I'm alone." Armin froze. He had not expected such words. They were not spoken with demand, not with power, but with a soft desperation that went straight to his heart. He did not know what to say. He had planned to return to his small room, to rest and prepare for another hard day. But how could he walk away from someone who asked him to stay, not out of wealth or command, but out of loneliness? He sat back down. For a long moment, silence filled the room again, but this time it was not heavy. It was calm, almost peaceful. She smiled faintly, grateful that he had listened. They continued to talk. She told him about her youth, how she had once been full of energy, how she had traveled the world with her husband. But after he died, she lost interest in everything. Armin listened, and in his heart, he felt a mix of respect and sadness. He realized that no amount of riches could protect someone from pain. Before dawn, he finally stood up once more. She walked him to the door, her step slow as if she wished to delay his leaving. "Thank you," she said again, her eyes soft. "You don't know how much this means to me." Armin nodded, holding his toolbox tightly. "I'll come whenever you call, madam," he said simply. As he stepped into the cool morning air, he felt a change within himself. This was no longer about money or survival. Something deeper had begun between him and the lonely woman in the mansion. Two worlds that had no reason to meet had suddenly collided, and neither of them would ever be the same again. The night that followed was unlike anything Armin had ever experienced in his life. He had entered the mansion only as a mechanic with a toolbox, but now he was sitting across from a woman who belonged to a completely different world. The teacups between them had long gone cold, yet their conversation did not stop. It was as if both of them had been holding unspoken words inside for years, and now, finally, they had found someone willing to listen. Armin spoke in his plain, honest way. He told her about his days in the garage, the smell of oil and metal that clung to him until night, the long hours under the sun, the stubborn bolts that refused to move, and the satisfaction that came when an engine roared to life after his hands had worked on it. He spoke of his landlord who always came knocking for rent, of the grocer who gave him food on credit, and of the neighbors who laughed and fought loudly in the narrow lanes of his street. Mrs. Noreen listened with full attention. For her, every detail was like a window into a life she had never lived. She had grown up in wealth, married into wealth, and remained surrounded by it. She had never stood in a garage with her hands covered in grease, never counted coins to decide whether to buy food or pay rent. And yet, in Armin's words, she sensed something richer than her own life, something real, something raw. Then it was her turn to speak. She told him about her youth, about her days as a young bride when her husband was still alive. She had traveled across countries, stayed in grand hotels, attended dinners with important people, and smiled in front of flashing cameras. To the world, she had lived a perfect life. But behind the glitter, she admitted, there were moments when she longed for simplicity, moments when she wished to sit in a crowded street and eat food from a roadside stall without worrying about appearances. Her eyes grew distant when she spoke of her husband. "He was my anchor," she whispered. "With him, this house was alive. After he was gone, everything became just walls and furniture. People still come here, relatives, friends, business partners, but when they leave, the silence grows heavier." Armin felt her loneliness in every word. It was strange for him. He had always imagined that people with wealth lived free from worries. But sitting there, hearing her voice tremble, he realized that loneliness was heavier than poverty. At least he had the noise of the world around him, she had only echoes. As they sat together, the sound of a clock ticking on the wall reminded them how many hours had passed. It was already late into the night, yet neither felt sleepy. Their voices filled the quiet mansion, breaking years of silence. At one point, Mrs. Noreen got up and returned with a small box. She opened it to reveal old photographs. She showed Armin pictures of her younger days, laughing with her husband, standing near beaches, smiling in gardens. The woman in those pictures looked vibrant, full of life, almost unrecognizable from the quiet figure sitting across him now. "This was me," she said, pointing at a picture of herself wearing a bright dress, eyes sparkling. "Sometimes I look at her and wonder where she went." Armin studied the picture, then looked at her. "She's still there, madam. Maybe she just needs someone to remind her." His words made her pause. For years, people had flattered her for her wealth, for her house, for her status, but nobody had spoken to her like this, with honesty, with warmth that carried no hidden desire. She felt her heart soften. As the night grew colder, she brought out a blanket and draped it across Armin's shoulders. "You must be tired," she said gently. "But thank you for staying." Armin shook his head. "I'm not tired anymore." And he meant it. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive, as though he was part of something bigger than himself. They continued talking, shifting from heavy memories to lighter topics. She laughed at some of his street stories, the kind of laughter that had been absent from her home for years. He told her about children in his neighborhood who would borrow his bicycle and never return it on time. She told him about a cooking experiment that had gone wrong during her early marriage, and how her husband had teased her for days afterward. Every story seemed to build a bridge between them. One from a small, broken street and the other from a giant mansion, yet both finding common ground in shared emotions. By now, dawn was approaching. The first hint of sunlight entered through the curtains. Armin realized he had spent nearly the whole night in conversation. He stood reluctantly, picking up his toolbox. "I should go now, madam. The day is starting." Her face fell slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, I understand. But before you go, Armin, promise me one thing: if I call you again, you will come." He looked into her eyes and nodded firmly. "Yes, madam. I will come." Her smile was soft, almost childlike, as though that one promise had given her something to hold onto. Armin stepped outside, the morning breeze brushing his face. As he walked back towards the noisy parts of the city, his heart felt different. He had gone to fix a switchboard, but he had ended up fixing something else, something in her heart, and perhaps something in his own. In the days that followed, he continued his routine at the garage, but life didn't feel the same. He found himself waiting for her call, not for money, but for the conversations, for the way she made him feel respected. He realized he had become more than just a mechanic to her. He had become a listener, a companion in the silence of her grand house. And for Mrs. Noreen, she found herself waking up each day with a little less heaviness. She had someone who saw her not as a rich woman in a mansion, but simply as a human being with stories and pain. That night of unlikely friendship had opened a door in her life she thought would always remain closed. The morning after that long night, Armin walked back to his small rented room with a strange feeling in his heart. The streets were beginning to wake, shopkeepers were opening shutters, children were running to buy bread, and the smell of tea came from roadside stalls. Everything looked the same as before, yet for him, something had changed. He carried his old toolbox as always, but this time it felt lighter, as if the weight of his life had been shared with someone else. For days afterward, Armin worked in his garage as usual, fixing motorcycles and cars, but every evening when the sun began to set, he found his mind drifting back to the quiet mansion with golden lights. He remembered the way Mrs. Noreen had smiled at his stories, the way she had looked relieved when he promised to return if she ever called. In a life where he was often invisible, where people treated him as just another poor worker, her attention felt different. It was not long before she called again. Sometimes it was for small things, a fan making noise, a lamp that flickered, or even just the water tap that dripped too much. Armin knew well that she could have called electricians or plumbers who lived nearby, but he also knew the truth. It was not the repairs that mattered, it was his presence. And each time he came, she welcomed him warmly, offering tea, food, or sometimes just her company. One evening, after he had finished fixing a garden light, she said something that surprised him. "Armin, would you consider coming regularly? Not just when something breaks, but maybe once or twice a week. This house is too big for me to manage alone. And I would like someone I can trust." Armin hesitated. He still worked full days at the garage, and he was afraid of losing that income. But before he could speak, she continued. "I will pay you fairly. More than what you earn at the garage. You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it." That night, Armin lay awake on his thin mattress. He thought about the garage, the long hours, and the little money that left him hungry most nights. Then he thought about the mansion, the calm evenings with tea, and the conversations that gave him peace. It was not just about the money though that mattered, it was also about the respect he felt there. For once, he was not just a mechanic with dirty hands. He was someone who mattered. A week later, he accepted her offer. From then on, Armin became a regular visitor at the mansion. Some days he fixed things, other days he simply sat and listened as she spoke about her past, her travels, her husband, and her loneliness. Slowly, a routine was formed. As weeks turned into months, their bond grew stronger. She began to ask him about his dreams more often. One evening, while pouring tea, she asked, "Armin, if you could have one wish in life, what would it be?" He smiled shyly. "My own workshop. Nothing big. Just a small place with my own tools, where I can work freely without anyone standing over my head." She nodded thoughtfully but did not reply immediately. Instead, she listened as he described his vision, how he would paint the walls, how he would keep it clean, how he would treat his customers with honesty so they would trust him. His eyes lit up as he spoke, and for her, it was like watching a young man dream of a future that seemed far away but still possible. A few weeks later, she surprised him. One morning, she handed him an envelope. Armin opened it to find legal papers and a set of keys. He looked at her in confusion. "It's a workshop," she said simply. "I bought it for you. It's not far from here. You always talk about your dream. Now it's time to live it." Armin's hands trembled. "Madam, I can't accept this. It's too much. I'm just a poor man." Her eyes softened. "And I am a lonely woman who has more money than I will ever use. Don't see it as charity. See it as a gift between two people who found each other when they needed it most. You gave me company. You reminded me I'm still alive. Let me give you something in return." Tears filled Armin's eyes. He had lived all his life fighting for small coins, and here she was, offering him not just money but a future. He knelt down, not out of obligation but out of pure gratitude. "I will never forget this kindness, madam. You've changed my life." From that day, everything began to shift. Armin opened his workshop. It was small, just as he had dreamed, but it was his. The first few customers came hesitantly, but soon word spread of a mechanic who was honest, who charged fairly, and who worked with skill. Business grew slowly, and for the first time, Armin felt dignity in his work. And Mrs. Noreen? She was no longer the lonely woman of the mansion. She had found joy in watching Armin succeed, in knowing that her help had given him wings. She visited his workshop sometimes, sitting quietly as he worked, smiling at the sight of people greeting him with respect. In return, Armin never forgot her. He continued to visit her mansion, not as a worker anymore, but as family. Their bond became something rare. It was not about wealth or poverty, not about age or status. It was about two souls who had met by chance one dark night and had filled each other's emptiness. Years later, people in the neighborhood would often wonder about the connection between the wealthy widow and the poor mechanic who now owned a thriving workshop. Some whispered stories, others made guesses, but neither of them cared. They knew the truth that life had brought them together for a reason, and that reason was simple: to remind each other that no one should live in darkness alone. What began with a broken light at 2 in the morning had turned into a light in their hearts that never went out. Armin had gained more than a workshop, he had gained respect, stability, and someone who believed in him. Mrs. Noreen had gained more than a helper, she had gained a companion who filled her silent nights with conversation and laughter. And so, their story became a quiet lesson for anyone who heard it that sometimes fate does not care about rich or poor, about palaces or small rooms. Sometimes, it brings two people together simply because they need each other.